Hey everybody, searched around on the internet and could not find any YouTube videos which explained setting up a scope on a 300 Winchester Magnum Ruger precision rifle. So thought I'd do a quick how-to video here on setting up a scope and covering all the parts you might need and what the steps might be in order to do a do-it-yourself scope job. What we got here is a collection of the parts that I've selected for this particular rifle. The first part, and the most important part, is going to be the Burris scope itself. And you'll notice that I selected the XTR2 8x40 50mm objective 34mm tube illuminated front focal plane scope. So that's the puppy that we're going to be mounting up today. Here's a picture of the scope itself. Now to mount this 34mm tube scope, I've collected a few other parts from Burris, namely some 34mm scope rings. The rings themselves are the XTR signature rings, and it comes with a pretty good instruction sheet. Because these rings have inserts which can be used to add or remove your cant from a canted scope base. This particular rifle, I thought this type of rings would come in handy because this particular rifle has since it's a Magnum version of the Ruger precision rifle, it's got a 30 MOA canted Picatinny rail here, and I'm not too sure I want a full 30mm cant, because I'd like this rifle to be accurate from about 50 yards on out to 1,000 or more. And it might be a little difficult to sight it in at the 50-yard range with that much of a down forward slope on it, because it'll be shooting pretty doggone high if the scope is mounted in there and not adjusted. But we'll see how that goes. I may end up having to pull the scope off, replace the inserts in order to bore sight it here at 50 yards and then move it on out to 100 and 200. This range only has a 200-meter maximum range at this particular shooting club, so to zero it at 300 yards is going to require moving to another shooting range and adjusting things later on. But the main purpose today is to get the scope mounted up and get the cheek piece and the shoulder butt plate adjusted for my particular relief, and figure out how the scope works, etc. So the Burris kit, the scope ring kit, comes with some really good scope rings that have torque screws, 6 torque screws per ring, as you can probably see there, and it comes with a couple of torque screws to mount to the Picatinny base, and a little American flag, which is a nice touch because they're made in America. So, and it also has a note here, 5 NOA insert, but it doesn't tell me if it's 5 plus or 5 minus. Anyway, I suggest you go out on the web if you want to learn more about these rings and this particular scope. The fact that the scope is 8 to 40 is pretty cool. I was thinking about getting a 60 power scope, but bang for buck I decided 8 to 40 is plenty. And I'm glad it's 8 to 40 because I'll probably be using about 14 to 16 power at the closer ranges and move on out to 40 power at the longer ranges, depending of course on the reticle and how I like the front focal plane reticle, which you can see this reticle is a little different than what most people are used to. So the F-class MOA reticle, and I looked through the scope the other day and found that you almost have to zoom in to about 15 power before you can actually see the tick marks on this reticle because of the fact that it's front focal plane. The reticle will change sizes depending on the power that you use. It's okay at lower powers as far as maybe just putting the crosshairs on an animal or whatever, but in order to pick up the actual minute tick marks or half-minute tick marks, you're going to have to zoom it in quite a ways to even be able to see the reticle because it's very finely etched on the lens. Anyway, first step here will be to mount up the rings and get the scope in there and try to figure out eye relief. So I'm going to go ahead and do that while the camera's off here because I don't have a camera person to help me with this. Okay, I disassembled the rings, and sure enough, the labeled ring there, the 5 MOA labeled ring, did have +5 and -5 inserts in it. The one that's unlabeled came with a couple of 0 inserts in it. And after reading the instructions and thinking things over, when I bought this rifle and researched it on the Ruger website, I thought it was going to come with a -20 canted Picatinny rail. But the Magnum rifle, as it turns out, comes with the -30 after doing further research and taking the rifle home. So I was hoping for about a -20. So what I'm going to do is take out about 10 MOA from the cant on the rifle by using a combination of rings which will remove 10 degrees angle of cant. The scope itself has about 70 MOA of adjustment in the vertical, so it's got quite a bit of adjustment in the vertical. So between 20 millimeters and 70, that's right up there to 90 MOA of adjustability at the long ranges. So that should be plenty. Although the more windage you end up using to zero the rifle in, the more it might reduce the vertical MOA adjustability of the scope. I spoke to a Burris technician about that, and he verified that when you use a lot of horizontal adjustment, it will reduce the overall vertical adjustment range of the scope. So just keep in mind for future reference that some of the word of mouth that goes around on the web, etc., is right and some of it's wrong. So don't take anything I'm saying today as 100% proof of what you may experience, but that's some information and tips that I've come across as an amateur in this field. I'm not a competitive shooter. I haven't spent a lot of time with long-range rifle shooting. I'm just getting into the sport. But that's just some things to think about when you're out buying a rifle. How much negative cant will you need, and which rifles provide the options, which scopes provide the options, which rings provide the options. So those are all things to take into consideration when making a purchase. Okay, the next thing to meet my objective in this example of 10 minutes of angle raising the scope, I will not be able to use the plus or minus 10 MOA rings all by themselves unless I use the 0 rings. So I may end up putting 0 rings inserts in the rear and try to space them at 4.75 inches center to center on the rings themselves, and that should provide me with 10 MOA of adjustment. Yeah, I've moved the rifle out of the scene here, but one more thing to consider after reading instructions is that it's best to keep the rings as far apart as possible to effectuate the least amount of stress on the scope. So I may end up picking a different combination. If I went with 4.75 inches of spacing, which is pretty good, I'll be able to use the rings I mentioned, the 20 MOA and the zeros. However, I might, it looks like this particular scope is long enough that I could use up to 6 inches of spacing. And the other factor, of course, is the Picatinny rail and mounting the rings on the rail and having the scope far enough back on the rail such that you got the right eye relief. So first things first, I'm going to go ahead and try a few different positions and a few different spacing combinations, and then try to determine my final selection on spacers based on that. Okay, so I found out that the separation works pretty good on this scope. As you can see, I've got it mounted right there, and by the time I got the cheek piece and the butt plate set up for my shoulder and cheek, and got the eye relief correct, you'll notice that the back set of rings is all the way back on the Picatinny rail, and I then moved the scope even further back than having the scope on the farthest forward position with that back ring set up there. So I moved the scope back to meet my eye relief and my comfort zone for the shoulder, and then I separated the front ring forward. It turns out that the Picatinny rail slots, if you pick the right number of slots, centers the rings perfectly, so that's good. Anyway, now I've got my ring separation and my scope where I want it, but I'm going to have to mark the scope, take it out, and put the proper inserts in, because I've been using a couple of 0 inserts just to figure eye relief and everything out. So my next move here is to pick the correct MOA pair of inserts before squaring up the scope and buttoning everything down. Okay, so I put the top of each ring on, and one screw on each side, the center screw of each ring on each side, and got it just lightly clamped down. Now, next thing is to double check eye relief, and then we're also going to have to try and get the scope as level as possible, especially for long range shooting. So first off, double check eye relief. Okay, so the eye relief looks good, and it looks pretty horizontal right here off the bench. Remains to be seen when I put the bubble levels on. But next step here is to just sort of double check scope alignment using a couple of bubble levels. You can get some magnetic bubble levels if you want, or in my case I'm using some old levels out of my Git kit. So I'll put the levels on there and just double check my level before I put any more screws in the rings and tighten things down. So with the bubble level on top of the scope here, with another one on the Picatinny rail, and a third one mounted up here on the foregrip, the hand grip. They're all setting, everything's level. So I'm going to take the levels off, double check the feel of it when I put it up to my shoulder, just to make sure it doesn't look cockeyed from a human perspective, and if that all goes well, then tighten it down. Everything looks good when I'm just looking through the scope. It doesn't look like the scope is cockeyed at all. And when I aim the scope downrange here at the targets on the backboard, which I have checked in prior visits here, that backboard is pretty much level on the left side there. Not all three of them, but the left one is very, very close to being perfectly level. With the scope and gun level and aiming down range, everything looks good, so I'm going to lock it in where I've got it now. When you lock these guys in, you should go in an alternating crisscross pattern until you get everything snugged up good and tight. And then I usually, because I do not have an inch meter, once I get things fairly snug, what I do is an extra quarter turn on each screw, and double check each screw to be snug after a quarter turn. You don't want to over tighten, but you don't want to under tighten. So what I use is guten tighten, the German phrase for good and tight. Anyway, good and tight, but not over tight. All right. Now that I've got a little experience under my belt, I basically managed to get everything even Steven all the way around. I went corner to corner and then center to center on each ring as I was tightening things down. After doing the front ring, I just moved to the back ring, and then back to the front ring, and then back to the back ring. I used the quarter turn technique until everything synced up, and then I went to a 1/8 turn technique for final adjustment. And that way you're not over tightening one particular screw and then having to catch up with the other screw by going about 1/8 of a turn at a time. So basically what I'm saying is, with this many screws in the rings, little baby steps towards the end of the tightening process is what works the best, or at least that's what I found out. Oh, and one last thing, don't forget to double check tightness of everything when you get done, including the base screws. And this Burris comes with torque screws instead of Allen screws, so luckily they provide all the proper tools in the kit, so you're good to go on that front. Anyway, don't forget to double check tightness of everything before you start banging away and sighting everything in. Also, I just noticed while I was tightening the base screws super snug, I felt them clicking. I think that's pretty cool. It's almost as though they've got their own built-in ratcheting system. So I'm not sure if the clicking was just a way they finally tightened down on the Picatinny rail, or if that's a trick of the trade that Burris came up with. But either way, once they started clicking for me, that told me I had them tight enough. Okay, next step is to do the bore sighting. Nice thing about the Ruger precision rifle, you can fold the stock open, pull the bolt out. So then you pick a target down range to try and center in your bore. I'm using a target down here of a human figure. And right now the bore is pretty much on the top circle of the head. The crosshairs are aiming that first large circle of the three large bullseye targets on the body. So that means if I aim low, I should be able to hit a little high, which is good because you want a long-range rifle hitting high at a closer range rather than too low at a closer range. So even though I've taken out 10 MOA on the scope rings, it looks like to start with I've got plenty of play to work with here. So my next objective is going to be to go ahead and set up a 50-yard target here, and eventually I'll move on out to the 100-yard targets. But let's just keep it at the 50 yards for less margin of error, hopefully. I'm going to put up a huge piece of butcher paper on this 50-yard target, so no matter where the bullet hits, I'll be able to tell what I got going. Okay, so I've set up the target down here, and I used a level to mark off some reference lines. And I measured the reference lines. Like I said before, it looks like the bore is going to be shooting a little higher than the scope, so I moved the orange bullseye down a little bit on the paper, and I'm hoping that the bullet hits high on my first shot here, and then I'll adjust from there. You'll notice I kind of made a nice horizontal and vertical grid line here with some amateur marks to use as reference points until I get the first few shots. Okay, we got the rifle moved down, we got the bench set up, and we're ready to try our first shot with a brand new Ruger precision rifle, 300 Winchester Magnum, Hornady, 165 grain, Superformance GMX ammo. I also noticed that the focus, I had to adjust the focus a little bit for the eyepiece at this range, but I had to crank the parallax all the way back to the 50, which is the minimum it goes to. There's still a little blurriness on target. So this scope is probably best suited for 75 yards on out, although you can hit what you're shooting at 50. You try to come any closer, 25 or so, it's a total blur. You wouldn't be able to see anything. It's just best guess if you try to shoot anything closer than that. So there's another piece of information if you're interested in this particular scope. I'm not going to leave the recording going between shots here, but it'll be a little too loud on the microphone, so we'll just turn the camera off, take our shot, turn the camera back on, and see where we landed. Okay, I took my first shot, and the trigger on this puppy, factory setting, is about 2.5 pounds. And boy, I squeezed that puppy off before I was sure I had it on target. So I'm going to have to take another shot now that I realize I got to be careful with that trigger. But it looks like it went about 4.5 high, maybe 4 high, 5 left, with a hair trigger, very, very sweet muzzle brake, hardly any kick to the shoulder at all, so that is nice. But let's try a more realistic shot on the second try here. By the way, the 2 magazines provided with this rifle are 5 rounds each, and they're metal, and they will not slide in unless you've got them perfectly straight with the alleyway, you might say. And so I had a little trouble getting the magazine in until I figured out it had to be perfect, and you kind of have to jiggle it around a little bit until you find the perfect alignment, and then it'll slide on in. I got a little frustrated and almost tried to force it. I would not suggest forcing it. It's a matter of perfect alignment. So the magazine fits very tight in the magazine well. So don't be surprised if you don't have any room for error on the magazines. Okay, I'm going to turn the camera off here again and try shot number 2, and hopefully I won't get any more egg on my face. Okay, that's why they call it a precision rifle. Apparently, you don't even have to be a good shot, and you can put a 2-shot group in about 1/4 of an inch. I'm impressed. I thought I pulled on that first shot, but apparently I had a somewhere inside the bullseye when I squeezed off the first shot. So I'm going to have to move it 5 MOA right, but that's at 100 yards. At 50 yards, it's going to have to be 10 MOA right. Now, interesting, brings up another topic. The scope rings that we purchased here, if I wanted to, I could actually remove the front 10 MOA spacer, and I could rotate it 90 degrees right, and it would move me 10 clicks, 10 MOA right. But considering that I'm only hitting 5 inches high with this 30 MOA Picatinny rail, I'm going to leave the scope rings alone. But there is that possibility. These rings can actually be used to help compensate for left and right as well as up and down. So that's for those of you that want to futz around and spend the extra time doing it. I'm not going to. I'm just going to use the horizontal adjustment on the scope and move myself basically 10 MOA right. Okay, once again I got to thinking about this and the 50 yard. I'm not too sure what I said before. What I did is I just cranked it 6 MOA right on the scope. 6 MOA at 50 yards should be 3 inches. 6 MOA at 100 yards should be 6 inches. So I'm going to take my next shot to verify that I'm thinking correctly and that the shot moves about 3 inches right. And then we will proceed from there. This scope, by the way, has 70 MOA adjustability up and down in the vertical, 30 MOA adjustability left and right in the horizontal. So I've just used up 6 of my 30 left and right without changing the inserts in the scope rings. Okay, there's our shot. And in fact, it did move just a little over 3 inches right. So we're on the right track. Need to move it another couple of inches right. Looks like maybe 1 3/4 inches right. So I'm going to do the math add in some more right hand clicks. Gonna move it right 3 clicks and down 6 clicks and see where we end up. Should be about 1 inch high and pretty much over the bullseye at that point. Well, I just learned something new. The scope came from the factory bottomed out in the vertical. So I cannot bring the scope down at all. That's kind of a bummer. I did move it to the right, so I'm going to go ahead and take my next shot. I'm a total of 9 MOA right on the scope. This scope has 1/8 MOA adjustments, by the way. When I was talking clicks, I was really talking MOA. So I've moved it 6 MOA the first time to get 3 inches, and now I've got it moved 9 MOA to achieve my 5 inches or 4.5 inches. We'll see if we get this puppy over the bullseye. The reticle on this can be used for elevation changes, so I'm going to ponder this a little bit before I get too carried away and change spacers on the rings and everything, whether I want to just use notes and reticle or elevation adjustments using the reticle. So anyway, we've moved the scope. Let's take another shot, see where we're at this point on the left and right horizontal at least. Okay, there was my next shot. It looks like I'm right at 4.5 inches high and less than a 1/2 inch left. Now the problem that I'm dealing with at this point, my reticle, the tick marks on my reticle only go 5 MOA above crosshair. So basically the bullseye is right between the right tick, the left tick, the top tick, the bottom tick above the crosshair in dead center. So the reticle is measuring things correctly. It knows what a 1/2 inch right and a 1/2 inch left at 50 yards is. It looks like if you were measuring things that bullseye is 2 inches wide when in fact it's 1 inch wide. Understand what I'm talking about. I might put an example snapshot in here just to explain it a little better. Now the problem is I cannot just use the reticle to lower my point of aim. So I'm going to pause the camera. I think I'm going to change my my ring inserts out and try to bring the bullet down using my ring inserts, which means the scope will have to be re-zeroed again. So when I get all done messing around, I'm not going to have a scope set up exactly the way it is now. Now my other problem is I need to think about this as far as long range shooting. The bullet should climb out to about 200 yards or so. It should still be climbing before it starts dropping at 300. If I try to zero it at 300, it'll be maybe 3.5 inches high at 200, maybe 2 inches high at 100, etc. And right now it's shooting nearly 5 inches high at 50, which is going to put it, you know, close to 10 inches high at 200. So I mean at 100, 10 inches high at 100 if my thinking is correct. And 10 inches high at 100 is way too high for this scope reticle to deal with. So I think my best bet at this point is to take some MOA out of the scope using the inserts in the rings. And what I'm going to do is change to a 20 MOA front ring set with a 0 MOA back ring set, and see if that brings me down to a near bullseye at 50 yards here. Okay, the barrel should be cold as ice by now, and I put the 20 MOA inserts in the front of the scope and readjusted and re-leveled the scope and tightened everything down, so we're ready to try another test shot. Right now we've shot 4 rounds, and these are our 4 holes, so we'll back things off here and see where the next shot ends up going after all this putzing around. Okay, we went from 10 MOA to 20 MOA on the scope, which leaves about 10 MOA on the rail. And the bullet came down 5, 6.5. So we made some progress. We should be able to now use the scope to start raising the bullet from here and moving it to the right. So what I'm going to do is give the scope a little adjustment upwards and see if we can put the next round. I guess I'll bring the windage over to the right a little. So up and to the right, and we'll see if we can put the next round in the bullseye, and then we'll be ready to move down to 100 yards. Well, I overcompensated in the up direction, and then I brought it back down halfway. So I went up 5 MOA when I should have went up 2.5. After I brought it down, I got a couple shots there in the orange. So at this point, I think to fine tune, it's time to go out to 100 yards, and we'll see if we should climb as we go out. So we'll see what happens. Okay, this video is turning out to be longer than I wanted, thanks to all the issues, but we're making some headway. Moved the target down here to 100 yards. Going to once again shoot at the bullseye, see where we end up after that. I should have marked some of the holes. I'm going to have to take a picture of the holes up above there so I don't get confused. But looks like we only got 1.5 holes exposed above the plate. The original 2 shots on the left there. So with a little luck, I managed to put the paper up horizontally or close to it, and I forgot to mark the actual plate itself, but the base of the plate is a 6-inch diameter, 1-inch bullseye, 8.5-inch diameter plate, 9 inches by the looks of it. So we will take a couple more shots before we have to stop and go home and eat dinner. Okay, I took the first shot. Looked like it came out about 1 3/4 inches high and maybe just a hair left. So time to fine tune. I'm going to leave the height adjustment just where it is. That's pretty good for right now. I want to move down to 200, but I'm not going to be able to do it on this video. Next video we'll go for some accuracy shots. Right now I'm just going to go 1/8 click right, 1 click on the dial, which is 1/8 of a minute right, and see where the next shot goes.